All right, welcome in everybody. This is our monthly HR Lunch Bunch. This is for the month of April, and we are talking a little bit about, or going to ask some questions around layoffs. And I want to make it really clear up front, before we even hardly get started, is that if we've got folks that are attending today, that doesn't necessarily mean they are planning layoffs or in the middle of, or it's on the horizon per se. This could be just very much educational information for people and or networking opportunities. And I say that because we're recording this session as we often do. People have their names or company names listed. People have the opportunity to share information and talk. And so I want to be able to encourage people. I know we're all HR folks here, and that's a good thing. And that hopefully means we also understand about confidentiality. But just because you see somebody attending doesn't mean their organization is going through layoffs. So I don't want that to be a thing for people to then start having conversations outside of this meeting or this, conversation today and spreading quote unquote rumors. So I thought I'd just put it out there, be really clear and specific. Some of you may be, and some of you may not be. And I want to be sensitive to that on your behalf. And if that means, which is always one of my desires, is to have people on camera and speaking up and having a conversation. If for some reason that isn't comfortable for you, that is certainly okay. Let's put that out there too. But I like to be able to talk to people instead of at people. And if we're going to have a lot of questions today, and we are, so just kind of heads up, sometimes we come to Lunch Bunch and it's a little bit more classroom oriented, as it were. This one, I really just have a bunch of questions. And then based on what you guys share, then kind of providing some additional information verbally. If there's some things that we reference that might be helpful to you after the program, as always, please know you can reach out to me and ask for stuff. I'm a big sharer. If I have it, you can have it. So if you don't know me, I'm Deborah Jeffries. I work here at HR Answers. I have for over 30 years. And while I serve as the vice president of the company, I spend a lot of my time on the educational side. So if I've got something, I'll share it with you. So just reach out. Here's my contact information and let me know. Now, with that said, let's hit the official. This is HR Lunch Bunch for April, and I'm glad that you're here. It's wonderful to have several folks, and based on our registration list, we should have several more. So we'll see if people can join us, or they're just going to watch later on demand. But truly, my goal is always to have a conversation at these. So while I am a trainer, I sometimes have a hard time turning that part of me off. And I think that's a plus and a minus when it comes to a conversation like this, because I want you to be able to network. I want you to be able to share. I want you to be able to ask your own questions of each other. This is an opportunity to share your experience, what's working, what's not working, what have you done, what are you learning, what are you experiencing, any of those kinds of things. And if you don't feel comfortable with that verbally, I do have the chat box open, and we can utilize that as a conversation communication, as well as you can direct message people who are in attendance. So how about we start getting going and we can talk a little bit about having maybe a little fun in a topic that is not what I would consider fun at all. But when we talk about layoffs, one of the things that I find inside our organization, working with our employers that reach out to us, is a lot of times they don't truly understand what a layoff is. And so when we think about separations, terminations, layoffs, they are not the same thing. And so I'm guessing that I don't really have to educate all of you. You're much more aware of that. But when we think about what are kind of the stages of layoff, there's an element of, in all seriousness, kind of being prepared. There's been a lot of changes over the last couple of months. We hear a lot of things in the news. Even before we got to this year, IT and software, some of our tech companies were going through some layoffs, and we saw that in the news. But when we think about these kinds of stages, and I would ask you, tell me, am I not thinking about, and these are kind of broad buckets, right? So we kind of have the before anything happens, and we're strategizing, we're talking, we're reviewing, we're thinking about our options, which I do want us to talk about today before we ever get to this decision, let alone a notification, the transition kinds of things that are happening within the actual departure. And then we've got the stuff after this goes through and the employees who are remaining and being thoughtful about them. Now, again, broad buckets. You tell me, is this a kind of reasonable kind of set of stages? Would you add more to it based on what you may have gone through in the past or conversations? Am I missing a step? Okay, well, there you go. Not hearing anything, not seeing anything in the chat box, so maybe I'm on the right foot with this. So when we think about kind of the pre-conversations of sorts, I think there's a big piece of this that is um, understanding what's going on with the organization, right? What are some of our most common kind of reasons for implementing kind of a layoff, let alone how to do it and how it impacts the organization? And I definitely want to talk about the alternatives. But for that first question, and what I did in this particular set of slides, just so you know, is I bolded one question out of the three that I really want to focus on. But I also think, and after the conversation before we even started today with the folks who came on early, what might be some of your reasonings or activities or conversations post, as in previously, let alone today, that maybe might be common reasons? What's going on for organizations?
So this is Courtney. I work for the Madras Aquatic Center Recreation District in Madras, and we have done 2 rounds of layoffs over the last 3 years, shrinking our workforce from about 35 to about the 23 we have now. And I'm looking at in May, if we don't pass measures to get us to a sustainable source of funding, laying off everyone except for 3 or 4 of us who will remain. So for us, it's a financial implications of poor sustainable budget planning for 10 to 12 years, and then getting hit with a lot of maintenance issues that then suck up those funds that we would have used for personnel.
And you bring up that piece about maintenance when we talk about infrastructures, or we talk, communities, counties, things like that. When we haven't done maintenance, or we haven't always done a good job of maintaining things, and then we get hit kind of hard. While it And I know it's not quite the same thing. There was research done recently about the fact that even from a family standpoint, most I'm trying to remember what the percentage was. It was over 50% of us can't sustain like $1,000 hit of some kind of an emergency. So if you think about like a water heater or something else inside your house, that's a huge hit. So if that's true for us as humans, individuals, organizations, just like our car, take maintenance and requirements. And so whether it's an apartment complex or pools for the summertime, all kinds of activities, being able to think about that. So thanks, Courtney, for kind of getting us started. What else do you guys think, those of you who are with me? Other kind of common reasons? I mean, money, obviously. Are there other things that might be thought processes?
Not for, this is Andrea in Klamath County, not for us in our situation because it is a funding issue, but I mean, in some cases it could just be, that the position isn't, there are positions that aren't needed anymore due to technology or different other types of situations like that.
Gotcha. Okay. Anybody else? Some thoughts weighing in on that? I will just share with you what I've heard from some of our clients is not only the economic factors, it might also be connected to like supply chain kinds of activities or new regulations that are coming in for a particular industry. Sometimes it's the automation component that's being introduced into the operation. And sometimes right now I can tell you that construction, remodel, plumbing, as long as it's not an emergency kind of thing. There are some of these things that are just a decrease in demand for the kind of product or the service. And again, it ties it back a little bit to economics or uncertainty. And so if people can quote wait, they're waiting. Or something that was a desired for home improvement. So being able to kind of think about that and just being a little bit more strategic from an HR standpoint, always kind of keeping up with what's happening in our industry and what kinds of things, how will we be impacted, so that then if we have to get to this kind of conversation, let's talk about alternatives before we ever even get to quote the decision. What other kinds of things do you think that the organization can do or consider? Because I think sometimes this can be one of those fight or flight kinds of things for an organization. There's one company that I know of in Salem. The first indication that there is going to be some sort of um, downturn or reduction in use of their business, the first thing the business owner does, he goes, I'm going to need to lay off people. That is his first thought. And in my mind, that should be our very last thought. What else could we be considering or looking at? If, especially in Courtney's case, she's referencing a substantial scenario based on the bond measures that don't pass. What is that going to look like? Well, I said bond measures in general. Um, what else might be, what might be true? What might be alternatives that we could look at?
Well, I can share one of the things that we've done is we have done a lot of cross training. And so we'll have staff members working half-time in one area and half-time in another. And so we've been able to collapse and try and keep them whole by giving them other job duties. So that's one thing we've done. Another thing we've done is we've looked at our job descriptions to try and expand them as much as possible so we can do that cross training within the positions that they're in without having to exponentially increase compensation as a result of different new duties. So we've done reorganizations with our staffing and our wage scale and our job descriptions, also just trying to keep people whole.
Exactly. Good. Well, and in the chat box, we have job sharing as one of the options. So others, what have you explored or what are you familiar with? Or are you hoping that I'm going to tell you? Okay, just remember this is supposed to be a discussion, conversation. It's not the Deborah show. I will suggest to you that do you have people who might benefit from or have an interest in early retirement? Right, that could be an option, and sometimes people work close to that anyway. Any hiring freezes, right? Furloughs, and making sure that you understand how those work and how they're different. Um, Job sharing, again, reduction of salary. I know a couple organizations who have said for 2025, there will be no pay increases. So that's been a way of them being able to reduce some dollars that was originally planned. However, given some uncertainties, being able to take a close look at the benefits. Oftentimes people will go there in terms of reduction of offering in terms of benefits, but it also is probably looking at what's really getting utilized and what's not. Being able to think about, do we have overtime? And maybe we're eliminating the option for overtime. that can save a tremendous amount of money. And if you, even if you couple a couple of these together, then does that get to us to a better budget scenario? It might be being thoughtful about the use of temporaries or contractors and reducing that or eliminating those. Maybe there is an opportunity for some operations for people to work from home, and that might be a savings depending on how you're functioning. Um, you could offer unpaid time off as a way of being able to kind of retain people, and yet, but what does that look like? There's also work share programs through the employment department that can help offset if you were to reduce pay uh, and still retain employees. And there's some guidelines that go with that by talking with the employment department. Sometimes they have, they, at least they have had these work share programs that allow dollars from the state to augment employees' pay to kind of quote help make them whole, let alone work share programs from the standpoint of maybe people going more part-time in their job sharing. So that combination, um, cross training, reskilling, those kinds of things. Um, gosh, I hate to say it, but maybe executives need to take a pay cut. That maybe they don't need all that money. Um, you didn't hear me say that. Yes, now it's recorded. But where are your expenses? What could we modify for, quote, if it's truly a layoff, this isn't supposed to be a forever. The idea is that when we have an opportunity to have positions come back open, the first place we would go is the people who we have laid off in terms of bringing them back. So that's why it's important for you to make sure inside your organizations that we're using the right language. Are we truly saying goodbye to people and there isn't an option to come back? Or are we truly laying off with the understanding and premise that we'll bring them back as soon as we can? Because that can be somewhat reassuring for people. But it also depends on how long, and there's often not a lot of certainty around some of those things. So I think those are some of the ones that I'm familiar with that can be other things to consider long before we get to the layoff conversation. So if you have other ideas, please put them in the chat box, and let us know so we can get those shared out to people as well. Let alone we've got that whole legal compliance and think for considerations. And they can be different depending on what state you're operating in. Just because we're housed here in Oregon, we do get a lot of visitors to Lunch Bunch that are from Washington, and we've had some as far as way as the East Coast. So being able to be really thoughtful about, do we have any specific state requirements? And we have the federal one in terms of WARN. If you're not familiar with the WARN Act, usually requires employers with 100 or more to provide a 60-day notice before any kind of quote mass layoff. And that could also be like a plant's closing. And so being thoughtful and a mass layoff, just so we're on the same page about what that looks like, usually is represented by laying off about 33% of your workforce at a single location. So that could be like 50 or more employees. Now in California, if anybody has a site location in California, it's 75 employees or more in terms of a mass layoff and definition of that. And clearly we have to, communicate to our employees what's taking place and how they're going to be affected. And again, I don't really like this word. Is this a permanent layoff, or is this more of a temporary kind of thing? And what is the expected duration? Because in some cases, some of us were talking before we got started today, if we've got if we're a labor organization, maybe you might have some bumping rights for consideration and thinking about that. So what else do we need to be thinking about when we think about legal or compliance, things that the organization needs to take a look at or consider? I can see you're all coming up with lots of options and ideas.
Well, I'm drawing a blank because I'm not generally, I don't this isn't something that I deal with. I'm a supervisor looking to go into management, just here more for information. So, I don't know how to answer that, but yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Well, then you're in the right place, Mel. We can help you out with that.
I'll participate. I'm just not sure yet.
That's not no problems, no problems. One of the things, one of the big ones is let's make sure from a discrimination standpoint, right? So when you think about when you think about the fact that this may be a move, what's the criteria? What are you looking at? So, what kind of percentage, X number of people, where are you currently at? Where's the organization now going to maybe be pivoting in some fashion or another? So when we think about the anti-discrimination kinds of things, we want to make sure I have seen and had conversations with people, and one criteria, most recent folks in are the most recent folks to go. Okay, that's one approach. When we think about race, disability, national origin, all of our protected classes under the law are things we have to be considerate of when thinking about layoffs, because is it predominantly all women, or it is a certain pay range of people, which might be our is it more of our executives, or is it something else? And so being able to think about what does that really look like, because keep in mind other people would quote be looking at this. So have we done our due diligence of paying attention to that? Because we don't want, any age discriminations coming back at us. So making sure that we're not basing any of our decisions on our protected characteristics, right? And keeping in mind Title VII and civil rights. So those are the kinds of things that I think are our biggest one. You might also want to consider if we've had employees that have utilized either OFLA or FEMLA, the old OFLA, Oregon sick leave, because if we're talking about the fact that eligible employees on protected leave, so how are we handling that? What conversations, let alone any of your other criteria that you might want to consider? What's been the documentation of performance for employees? While that's not a, 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 a while that's not a protected group per se, being able to justify what does that look like? Because somebody potentially could ask questions, right? So if you have any employment agreements, all of those must be reviewed beforehand, right? Because if they're associated with this, they could be impacted. And so individual employment agreements or collective bargaining agreements, they may have a number of requirements, and maybe we haven't really visited that because it hasn't had to be a thing, right? Because there might be giving the notice might be in there under the collective bargaining agreement, bumping rights, rehire eligibility, final pay, severance pay, or benefits. What does that look like? In the state of Oregon, we have age discrimination 40 and above. So if everybody we're laying off is over the age of 40, that could present an opportunity for someone to take a closer look. And usually we try with severance agreements to give people notice of severance options. And I think it's 45 days to be able to kind of review some of that. And they can say no to a severance offering. So especially, again, employers 40 and older in terms of work units. And then just, when you think about all employees, we have to pay all employees through their last day of employment, and making sure that that is done in a timely manner. Any commissions, any bonuses, vacation pay, and then continuing with COBRA. and making sure that those are all part of your communication, part of your thought process, and making sure that that's notated, your documentation, that you actually looked at some of those things or considered what that might look like for you. Because if you have some gaps or blank spots, again, that's where somebody can come along and say, well, did you consider this? Did you look at this? Did you look at this? And you know, severance packages are not legally required, but that might be a way to soften some challenges. We also have your unemployment benefits. Should, you know, HR should inform employees about their eligibility for that in terms of what benefits or application process. So while it may not be something that we've already made the decision, it would be something that offering them support and services, which I believe is one of my other questions to you a little bit later. And let's face it, confidentiality has to be a big factor. And while that may not be legal, it's also compliance considerations for people's dignity, for the affected employees. Obviously, people will know when people aren't there, but how we went through that, how our conversations. So maintaining that confidentiality throughout the process as best you can will be important. I think those are the things I'm thinking of. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything else that might be helpful. But I have seen people do seniority based, employee status kind of based selections, merit based, skill based, are typically the ones that kind of come to mind in terms of some of the considerations that people have. Am I missing something? Are there things you guys have also tapped into that you can share with the rest of the group? Okay, so it sounds like I have a group of folks that this is kind of this will all be a learning activity for those of you who might have to be going through this, or just conversations with other organizations because your network is vast, right? And so maybe it's not happening for your organization, which I really do hope that that is a reality. But being able to have just a little bit more information to have better conversations, even inside your organization, right? Because one of the things in general is what's the communication? How are we communicating? When are we communicating? How much we're communicating? How do we want to, if you have maybe connected to an association or with inside your organization, a marketing, PR type related individual, this is a good time to tap into those skill sets. Or if you have writers that you can be connected to, because how do we want to communicate this? Because there's going to be the internal communication that might lead to an external communication, right? And so before, if HR is doing, quote, the layoffs, or if managers are involved with this and tasked with the communication, they need to be equipped with, I mean, in some respects, the skills, but they've got to have the knowledge to be able to answer all those questions that are going to come their way. And this is really where our emotional intelligence can kick in, because we're talking about having some compassion here in terms of, you know, empathy and understanding what people might be feeling, what they might be going through, that it might be a shock and surprise that this is coming. This is about being able to be a really good listener, right? So when we think about not only what we're going to communicate, but then the skills that's going to take, and having it be clear communication, being transparent as much as an organization wants to about the reasons behind the decisions that they're making, let alone the communication, you know, before the layoffs, during the layoffs, and definitely after, because you're going to have staff that are going to be quote unquote the survivors. And what are they feeling and what are those emotions? How are we dealing with the body of work or the volume of work in some fashion? So this is also, I think, when we talk about a little bit of change, it's a lot of change. Then how are, us being patient with that, and maybe learning new things or learning new ways of doing things, people feeling anxious and uncomfortable with these kinds of situations, having an open door policy for people to be able to feel like they can come and have that psychological safety to have a conversation. So those are the kinds of things that when we think about departments, locations, what's the impact on the workflow, assuring staff who are remaining, they're probably going to be looking for reassurance. So one of the things I think that would be a big deal is making sure, how can HR support managers, if they're the ones delivering it, but they need to have their own kind of like mini training program about what to expect or how to expect things or how to respond to things or what things we don't want them responding to. And that needs to be directed back to HR or to another individual in some fashion. Um, and and we're hearing in the chat box that I've been on the receiving end of a layoff, and it's definitely emotional. And I keep thinking in my head what I've seen on the news recently about people at the federal government level, and they're getting letters that basically say your performance has not been that great. And the answer is they've had no performance challenges, and we're no longer in need of your services. That is a statement. How does that feel for someone hearing you're in no longer need of my services? And it's like, that sounds so transactional. And especially if we've had employees being with us for a long time and we have personal relationships with some of these people. Um, so um, if there are services part of your EAP, if there's other programs that might be part of your industry that might be available, we can make some resources available. And so we can kind of talk a little bit about that when we talk about the after the fact. But oftentimes when we think about communication, and I'm forgive me if I'm kind of being too obvious about some of these things, but we're talking about, talking to the employee kind of in a private location. This is a time when we need to get straight to the point, briefly explain what's going on, listen to the employee for, responses or reactions to things. But this also might mean that we're like restating what we've just said because maybe all of a sudden they're not registering with us. But the idea is this is not supposed to be a long drawn out because it can be emotional on both parties' part. But the whole concern of what's the right level of compassion and empathy and listening. And if I'm not careful, is the message going to get convoluted? This isn't an opportunity to negotiate and ask for the job or ask for a different position or try and negotiate other alternatives once we've made that decision. And that might be the employee's mindset of, can I find some other way to stay? So being able to, by moving that kind of conversation along, describing the assistance that the organization may offer. And that might be job searching skills or resume assistance. It may be that there's another organization or two or three that we're aware of that's actually hiring and looking for some of our skill sets in terms of our employee base. So being able to be thoughtful about, are there some resources, support that can be offered? Maybe it's someone from your EAP coming into the organization, especially if we're doing a large group, and they can bring several people, or we're giving enough advance notice that there's some time to hold those meetings or sessions with folks. And because ultimately, then we're handing them or giving them some kind of letter, and being very clear about what's the date of separation. But it's extremely important that you give the employees an opportunity to, I think, as the young people say, feel all the feels, um, to be able to have that sympathetic ear, and you know being able to, I mean, this would be something to be sharing with managers, to be able to listen without being defensive, right? Because the answer is it wasn't necessarily their decision. And so can we put ourselves inside the employee's shoes, so to speak? And keep in mind, part of this communication piece also is going to be, do we need to get people's keys and computers, um, access information that we're going to need to, if there's logins and passwords, that those are all going to have to be disabled for the people who are departing. What kind of timeline does that look like? Who might be involved? How many working with IT or someone else is doing it? And again, if there's amount of time, keeping that open kind of communication. So it is not an easy conversation for anybody, but I think one of the things to also is, as many of there are kind of the to-dos in the communication, you probably also want to be a little bit thoughtful about the don'ts, right? This is not a time for humor, and sometimes when people are stressed, humor is their way of kind of coping. If we start engaging in the small talk, then again, does that kind of dilute, here's what we're here to do and why I need to do it? And it's not that it's my preference, but it is kind of the thing that the organization has made a decision about. You can be thoughtful about being supportive. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to be apologetic. Because sometimes this can be, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. That can also make employees that are departing even more uncomfortable, but you also then are owning something that might not actually be yours to own in that regards. Um, this isn't a time to let people know the other people who are being laid off. That's not necessarily this conversation when we're doing something one-on-one. Um, any personal kind of feelings or anger that you might have, this isn't the time to be sharing that, because that only makes it about you and not about them. And so being able to be thoughtful about those kinds of things are also, um and we don't want to downplay an employee's concerns or emotions. Like, this is the best thing that ever happened to you because now you can go off and do X, Y, and Z. No, no. But I think you also need to think about that manager training or education time is, how are employees going to react? Do we have any sense of how they might take this news? Oftentimes, people who work in finance could tell that this was coming long before any organization makes an announcement. But there can be shock, which oftentimes can be silence, right? There can be disbelief. They don't even want to believe it. It instantaneously can start having this negative attitude, blaming people or things, that anger, or really a good portion of his fear of kind of the unknown. You always want to have Kleenex close by because this is a loss of something. And so there's grief, right? So there probably could be tears, depending. People are going to be concerned about how to go home and tell whomever might be on the home front. So not only are these our kind of first employee kind of reactions, also your own, and being able to acknowledge those feelings, and keep in mind that when we think about people departing and being gone, the after effect, there's probably going to be some loss of productivity, or could even be some absenteeism of the people who are remaining, depending on how they're doing. If you've got a delay in the time frame from the announcement to when the final day is, there can be loss of productivity, absenteeism, maybe increase in accidents. a resistance to the change, not only from the people who are going, but the people who are staying. And so you also want to be thoughtful about, would anybody taking precautionary measures for any kind of sabotage to be happening, where they're taking down a system or manipulating information or taking things that don't belong to them. So being able to be thoughtful, because if you don't kind of anticipate some of these things, you won't know how to respond. And so being able to maybe even do a little scenario planning. Let's say Billy Bob is the person who's really going to have an emotional outburst about this. What might be some of the things you're going to think about or want to do, or how to handle or tackle it? So I don't know if any of that is helpful observations to you or not, or now that I've shared those things, do you have some other ideas that might come into play with your communication?
I think that there's a lot of benefits and disadvantages to working for a small district. So I'm the executive director and the finance director and the HR director and the risk manager. So I'm the only manager in our district.
Okay.
So and with me, there are 5 other adults who are full-time and part-time, and then everybody else is seasonal teenagers. So
Gotcha.
one of the benefits of being in a public sector, I'll say a normal local government public sector, is when we're doing these discussions about what our finances look like, it's all in the public. And so I think when you talk about communicating effectively, it's about being aware of what you're going to be presenting to the board in a public meeting and getting ahead of that with your staff. Is super important. I learned that the hard way a number of years ago, and always make sure that whatever I'm presenting, I've already shared with my staff, so that they're ahead of the curve. The other thing that I think is challenging, and particularly in our scenario, is we've known since last year that we were going to need to put ballot measures on. And so all the staff know that if these things don't pass, they are losing their jobs, potentially. And so, and there are days when morale is great and we're all pretty sure that, things are going to pass and we're going to grow. And then there are days when we have to plan for worst case scenario. And I think as we get closer to May 20th, I can see that it's really wearing on a couple members of our team. And, because we're a small team, humor is a big part of what we do. And we've kind of been dealing with it with humor in our office. But I think it's that you don't want to give too much time, because that's what we have. And it's really hard to maintain a positive attitude. That's something that I've personally been struggling with myself, as the one who's going to get to deliver to, 23 staff what the outcome of this is. But then also, if you don't give enough of that notice and they find out because you were in a public meeting, then that's another trust breaking problem. So to me, it's the hardest thing is threading that needle of being transparent, but also not weighing on your staff too much, especially when you're not in a professional organization. I'm the only, I mean, I don't mean to say it like this, but I'm going to. I'm the only professional in the organization. And so I've got someone that is also semi-professional. But, everybody else, we're in aquatics, we're in recreation. It's young, seasonal, and part-time workers where this is their first job. So anyway, that's a lot, but it's what I was feeling and thinking about as you were going through this part of the conversation, for what it's worth.
Well, and I think, honestly, Courtney, I think you bring up an observation in terms of how much time you have, knowing that there's a date, right? There's a time frame associated with an outcome that is beyond your control in that respects, right? You can't control the outcome. You might be able to influence some things. I could imagine that some staff members are maybe so stressed or worried or concerned or put in the emotion, that they're not willing to wait until an outcome of May, that they're already deciding, I'm just going to go ahead and start looking for employment elsewhere. And then if that is true, on one hand, your number becomes smaller in terms of layoffs. They've made a choice. But if it turns out to be a positive and we get the funding and then we didn't need to lose those individuals, however, people will take care of themselves or take care of their families, whatever's going on for them. And that is something, again, where then we can have loss of productivity in a different kind of way. Because if we have a couple people who are already departing, what are other employees thinking and feeling about that? We haven't even gotten to D-Day, decision day. And the answer is, so all of those things I think are wonderful observations. And yes, definitely when you've got a board and it's public sector and those are public meetings, and those things don't stay private at all, right? And so being able to be thoughtful about that. So those of us in the private sector might have a little bit more buffer. If we're publicly traded, there's going to be elements of that. So just being able to be really thoughtful about those things, which is why this is should never ever be kind of here, this is what we're going to do. It's quick and easy. And it may be a major cut to dollars, but there's a whole lot of other things at play here.
The other piece too that you just made me think about was we have a policy in our handbook that employees can't have a second job unless they have written approval from their supervisor. And so I have signed probably 15 of those in the last 6 months. So a lot of our staff have gone out and gotten second jobs and they're working a few hours a week, but know that that's their backup plan. And I've been more willing to sign off on those over the last 6 months than maybe I would have been otherwise.
Absolutely. Well, and in some respects, more power to everybody, to be perfectly frank with you, because we're not adhering. This would be an opportunity for the exception to the policy, right? This is when we can have exceptions to policy. Absolutely. We just notate why that was a reality. So now we have people who are still with you, but they also have a backup plan. But they've communicated that with you and created the environment of one open communication, transparency, a building that well before this situation, one of trust, to be able to come to you and ask and explore that. And yes, I want to stick around, so that we're all in the same place. Because it is my honest belief, I do have a bias, that people do better with information than without it. I know what I can deal with. I know what now is kind of coming my way. Even if it's, we really don't know, the fact that you're communicating with people on an ongoing basis, that is reassuring. It may not be as much as people would like, not even as much as you would like to offer. But when you don't know, you don't know. But when you don't know and you don't say anything to anybody, they probably have the messages in their head. Oh, they know. They know what's going on. They know who they're going to pick, or they know what they're doing, and they just don't want to tell us. And that may not be anywhere close to the truth. We have narratives in our head. And if, like the person who's already been part of a layoff, how did that one go? Is anybody bringing any baggage from previous activities with an organization? And they would bring that to your current situation, which might not be at all the same. All right. I think there's some good stuff here. So then we have the, supporting the effective employee. Can you think about like what kinds of support, what kind of offering for some kind of transition? I've obviously put on the slide here outplacement services, but what else might be offerings that you could bring to the table, or you guys have talked about in some fashion or another? Even if you haven't done it, can you think of some things that would be true?
Support meaning maybe severance pay and maybe some benefits.
Could be. Because again, severance isn't a requirement. But oftentimes it's also about back to budget, right? How much money do we have?
Correct.
The reason we're doing a layoff is so you know, Cobra's going to be kind of a standing one, but are there maybe something else that people would be able to, I mean, this might sound a little corny of sorts, and probably maybe I'm bordering on not okay, but Courtney's in an environment where we've got recreational kind of somethings, right? So can we offer departing employees the opportunity to utilize the services at no cost? You know, coming in, they when they were an employee, they got that, but now we're saying goodbye to them. Yes, we want them to find another job. We've maybe offered to have them a temporary service come in and aid. Maybe we've brought in somebody. Again, it's going to depend on the kind of positions that you have. Maybe we've brought somebody in to aid in resume writing skills or interviewing skills, especially if it's been a minute since people have done some of those things. Um, so I know HR Answers, we used to have this kind of job search guide. And when some of our organizations were going through some challenges, I would go in and walk through and do some things with them as a resource, as a support to the departing employees. And sometimes I had one client, kind of a healthcare oriented one, that did some things because they believed their funding could get cut. And this was, oh gosh, at least a decade ago or so. And so they put some things and measures and training and education in advance so that people had it, and it wasn't a post decision. It was, if this happens, because again, they were getting federal dollars. So they kind of had a little bit of a view on the horizon. They knew budget money could get cut. So they were providing resources in advance, so that people could be prepared, better prepared. Ultimately, they ended up getting their funding and they didn't have to cut those jobs. I will tell you that of the dozen or so people that I spent time with, because I also got to do some one-on-one coaching with them, if they opted for that selection, it was completely employee choice. Two of them did end up departing. The others all stayed and didn't have to, because again, the grant money came through. So being able to kind of think about what could that look like in your organization? Is there something that you can offer to them? I don't have a swimming pool or any recreational anythings to offer, right? And most people that depart us would not need HR consulting support. So being able to think about, is there anything that you can do? Because it could be some coaching. I want to say career coaching, but it might be, are there pivots that they can make? Again, job search assistance, resume writing, or someone who will review their resume, like mock interviews to get practice time on interviewing, or maybe even a list of interview questions you might want to ask your next employer to make it a more meaningful kind of interview, right? So being able to kind of think about, is there something that you have in-house that you can offer? People who are experts in certain areas. When you think about being part of an association, is there an association job board? Is there a resume writing group or something within that? Because sometimes that will take place within an association. They have meetings for networking. We want people to get to those. So being able to kind of think about what kinds of things you could do, or what's available out there. The employment department, people might not think of them as a first choice. That might be good, in terms of getting people signed up with or familiar with. Any other kind of networking opportunities where people are able to meet, uh, whether it's through the chamber or something along those lines, let alone, again, and is there any skill building we can do inside the organization for other positions that might, because they know the history of the organization, they've worked within the culture. Are there opportunities there? So being able to think about upskilling or reskilling any of our folks, let alone maybe there's, um, just support groups, or facilitate group mentoring of some sort or another. Working with an outplacement service can be of help. Because keep in mind, I think, Courtney, she didn't say this per se, but we're also talking about your brand as an employer is at play from a standpoint of how we go about doing this, how people are going to see it, hear it, feel it internally, externally, and especially if you're more customer facing in some fashion or another. So being able to kind of think about what does that do to you in some fashion or another, because we want to be able to maintain as many of those positive relationships as we can, and as smooth and respectful offboarding kind of activities as we can with folks. So being able to kind of think about that as part of our support to the effective employees too. Maybe depending on what's kind of been the culture of the organization, how people are really feeling, is there some kind of farewell event, meal, activity to being able to truly say thank you to the employees while, we, because again, this isn't what would be our first choice. Um, but again, that might be part of depending on how you're set up. I don't want to breach confidentiality, but is it something that makes sense given your environment or your people that are impacted, how the organization wants to work with this? Maybe your organization has some kind of alumni network, past employees. We're reaching out to them to stay connected, or that we want to create one because of this situation so that people are staying connected. Because sometimes when we lose a job, it can be feeling very isolating, and people can withdraw into themselves. But if we've got something, and again, what's kind of the culture of the organizations to be able to continue that, let alone all the other things that we said in terms of open door communication, those kinds of things to be thoughtful of. Because truly we're talking about maintaining that engagement and productivity from existing employees. So how we treat departing employees is going to leave a lasting impression with our existing employees. Are we talking to them about what challenges they think they're going to face, or how we're going to do the work, or maybe there's going to have to be some rebuilding of trust or communication or morale inside the organization because of the change, the transition that we're having. So I would ask you to be thoughtful about that, because in some respects, for some of these survivors, there will be a sense of relief. The decision's been made, the movements have taken place, and yes, I might be feeling a tremendous amount of guilt, but also relief that is, you know, that's over. But usually it kind of goes relief, guilt, anxiety, then maybe anger, right? And so the survivor syndrome might be in play. So being able to be thoughtful about what that looks like, because our lack of engagement or lack of productivity or increase in absenteeism, that's really going to start impacting our work. And depending on what that looks like, it might lead to some other challenges or complications. But the more we can kind of encourage some collaboration with our remaining employees is going to be extremely important. So I don't know if you guys have any additional observations there, that for remaining employees, it does take some time to kind of adjust. There's no doubt about that. One of the things that if people would like, I did kind of create a list of kind of some common questions that individuals kind of usually kind of experience if they're having a layoff, or the guilt, like, why did I survive the layoff when others didn't? And so maybe if you're interested, you can, if you'd like to have a list of those questions, because those may be things, again, back to that kind of mini manager training. How are we responding? What kind of you anticipate from folks? It's not the be all end all list. But you know, sometimes people, should I feel guilty? I don't feel guilty. I'm grateful I didn't lose my job. I'm sad for my colleagues, but they aren't feeling that way. And it's like, is that normal? Is that okay? They might just want to process their feelings. And again, if you have an employee assistance plan or can work with another organization, maybe bring in people, because maybe this is, you want them to have those conversations with someone else who's not as tied to the organization. Maybe that's, an observation for you as well. So those are some of the key questions that I kind of have for you. Hopefully there was also some information share in there too. And I really appreciate the contributions both in the chat and verbally. So as I kind of usually end our conversations of sorts, is there something here that resonated for you? Something that you can take back to the organization or to someone else and share? Is there something you need to start working on, or is there conversations to have? And again, not everybody who's attending today is going through any kind of layoff. This can be purely educational. It might also be, maybe there's an opportunity to start doing a little preparatory work. If we were to encounter something like this, how prepared are we to know what we need to do or how we need to do it? So that you're not learning while you're building the plane, so to speak, right? That you actually might have some things in place. But this might be also, I say wonderful, a wonderful opportunity in terms of networking with others who have gone through something like that. And what did you do? How'd you do it? What was like the biggest surprise? What's the biggest miss in some fashion or another, so that you can be better armed and prepared. So again, not necessarily the first conversation you want to be having with people, but this is where your network can really pay off. Who knows who might be able to help in some fashion. Okay. So do I have questions or other observations or thoughts? I welcome all of them. I'm seeing some notes in the chat about helpful, informative. Glad I was able to make it. So that's one of the reasons why we're here. I really, hope that you guys, I really appreciated your guys' observations. So thank you for those contributions. It also makes me think from time to time. So as we are kind of wrapping up our time, because it's about that time, next month, May 7th, Wednesday, 12 noon. So again, just as a reminder, meet the first Wednesday every month, unless there is some kind of major holiday or something like that. We're going to have supporting workplace wellness or workplace well-being through mental health awareness. And this is going to be Michelle from Cascade, Michelle from Canopy, is going to come in and spend some time with us talking about what that kind of looks like. And maybe it's just perfect timing, well-being through mental health, if we're having some not so wonderful things happen inside our organizations, or you can share that with other people who might be going through something. And then our next one will be on June 4th. And it would appear I didn't put a title on that, but I do believe that we have one. I do believe I have a guest who will be joining us on that day. So apparently I must have got interrupted and stopped in the middle of my thought process. So we will make sure that we put that out on our website and send it out through social media, as we do with any other program. And again, I always encourage people to share topic ideas with me so that I'm trying to be more timely or specific and meet the needs of our HR professionals and organizations and what they're looking for and needing in terms of discussions. So we'll call it official. I'll be the last one in the room. I'm happy to hang out with people and answer any questions or provide additional information or whatnot. You just let me know what you need and we're happy to do it. All right. So thank you for joining me for this one. I really appreciate it. Thank you. You guys take care and have a good rest of your day.